Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Western Counties Leadership Hustings, and a special welcome to our two candidates, Ed Davey and Layla Moran. I'm Don Foster, the former Bath MP and now part of our team in the House of Lords, and I'm chairing tonight's event, helped by Gavin Grant and staff from Party HQ, and thanks to all of them. But thank you also to the very many members who submitted questions. And I apologize in advance to those whose questions we simply may not reach. Where several people have asked a question on the same issue, I've composited them. However, throughout the proceedings, you can share your thoughts with others or pose supplementary questions. If you're watching the live stream page on the party's website and want to participate, then hover your mouse over the text that says, "Want to join the conversation, watch on YouTube" to enable chat, then click and you'll be taken to the YouTube page. If you're already on YouTube, you'll have the chat function already. Please be aware that non-members and journalists will be watching our proceedings, but above all, please remember we're Liberal Democrats and we respect each other. Now, we're going to begin by allowing each of the candidates 3 minutes to make opening statements, and then we'll go into the questions. So for the opening statements tonight, we're going to begin with Layla. Over to you, Layla.
Well, thank you, Don. Thank you all for watching this evening. And of course, some of you may well have already voted for our next leader, but if you haven't, then I urge you to seize the moment to change our party's future. Let's move forward together. I know in Western counties, we've made some brilliant gains in the last set of elections, including taking control of Bath and North East Somerset Council, highlight being, of course, making Jacob Rees-Mogg's councillor a Liberal Democrat, and Vera Hobhouse increasing her already impressive majority in Bath, and helping take the council off Tories in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole. However, more nationally, as a party, we are in danger of slipping into the realms of irrelevancy. We need a leader who can drag us out of the doldrums of single figure polling and reverse a council-based decline that in fact has halved over the last 10 years. A more of the same approach won't cut it. There is a place for bold liberal ideas in this country. And I know this because since the December elections, I've made it my job to understand what matters to members and, more importantly, voters up and down the UK. My vision for the country is well informed. And under my leadership, I'd encourage a renewed Liberal Democrat Party to campaign on policies that really matter to people, that work for you on the ground, where you're not embarrassed to deliver an HQ leaflet. We need to champion bold, progressive policies for people across the UK who have been so badly let down by this government of charlatans. The central pillars of my campaign, education, the environment, and the economy, form the basis of this, but by offering solutions which improve people's lives in the areas that they care about, we will speak to a broad base of voters and communities again. And it's more important than ever, particularly with critical elections coming up this May. I know how crucial these will be, including in places like Bristol, where we haven't seen an election since 2016. This could be a huge leap forward. Our party has some brilliant policies, and it will be my priority as leader to support you in communicating them. I get essential media cut through, whether it be on the major news outlets, on front pages. I've had over 300 positive media hits, from a focus on my cross-party inquiry into COVID-19 to calling out our atrocious government's lack of transparency. But I want us to use this cut through together to win over, particularly in Conservative-facing areas, soft Conservatives, but in Labour-facing areas, people who might lean towards Labour or the Greens. It's what I did in my constituency. I gained support from moderate Conservative voters as well as parties on the centre-left. The result was overturning a 10,000 Tory majority, and we need to repeat this all over. So in this leadership election, I'm the candidate who can move us on from the last decade, rebuild trust, and power a political comeback. Please consider voting for me and vote for change today. Thank you.
Layla, thank you very much indeed. And now it's Ed.
Thank you, Don. Friends, These are challenging times, with the worst recession for 300 years, COVID, Brexit, the climate emergency. The West's economy is being hit hard, from tourism to hospitality, from councils' finances to the self-employed. As leader, I bring both vision and experience to show how liberal ideas are the best for creating the jobs of the future. Take the economy and climate. Too often they've been separate. My Green Economy Recovery Plan brings them together to invest in green homes, green transport, green energy with a green jobs guarantee. I can deliver this green vision because I've experienced doing it before. I fought the Tories on climate and won. In government, I more than trebled the UK's renewable power, with Britain now the world leader in offshore wind. We have the best climate change record of any party. And from supporting agriculture to boosting low carbon transport, from backing more renewable energy to building zero carbon homes, our future green vision must be radical and distinctive. But a future greener economy must also be fairer. From working on a universal basic income as Paddy Ashdown's economics advisor, to devising policies like a penny on income tax for education, I've always backed progressive ideas to build a fairer society. So post-COVID, let's campaign on caring. The UK has almost 10 million carers, 3 times as many people who voted Lib Dem in 2019. Let's be the voice of carers. My own experience in caring started as a young carer. Dad died when I was 4, so when Mum became terminally ill when I was 12, I nursed her for 3 years till she died. Now Emily and I care for our children, including my disabled son, John, who needs 24/7 care. So I understand what so many carers go through every day. My life experience helps me relate to people, to voters, and to their challenges. In the general election review, you see our party's challenges and the conclusion: there are no quick fixes. And the sharpest criticism: people don't know what voting Liberal Democrat means. My vision answers that: a greener, fairer, more caring country. Friends, we can win. I get quality media cut through, like after I forced commitment from Boris Johnson for an independent inquiry into COVID. And I'm an experienced campaigner. I'm the only MP in our party's history to win without being a target seat. Friends, while times seem tough for our party, remember the first nationwide election under Paddy Ashdown, when we scored less than 6%. And remember how Paddy led the rebuilding, starting in the West and Southwest? I will rebuild the Lib Dem team on secure foundations so we can win, win big and win here. Thank you.
Ed, thank you very much indeed. Now, both of the candidates have already done something like 20 hustings. They've got another 15 still to go. We've got a good bunch of questions to ask them. And we're going to kick off with one from Neville Farmer. And Neville says, Paddy said the party needs to be more radical. As the other two parties drift apart, that leaves room for a radical centre. But that requires a big picture vision to inspire people outside the party. How would you inspire them? And why would your vision be radical? And Ed, if you can kick us off.
Well, the vision must start with liberalism, our belief in the individual, about giving them the best chance in life. So I've been talking about fairer society, meaning investment in education, in young people, in our children, and in, frankly, people who've missed out on education. So people can have the best chance in life. And I want to talk about a greener economy because I think that it can be distinctive. Because of our strong record and our much more ambitious vision, we can show that we're radical. I want to change the whole of capitalism. I want to make sure that we have a green economy, a green finance centre. You couldn't get more radical than that. And of course, I want to change our rotten political system. That starts by devolving power. Liberal Democrats are the party of local government, are the party of devolution and decentralisation. You know, Paddy used to say, we were the most radical people because when we got into power, we'd give it away. And Paddy was right. That is what liberalism is about. So we do give power to people and communities. And of course, there's electoral reform. I think the chances, my friends, of electoral reform have never been stronger. So we must champion that. And what a radical agenda that would be. You know, a much fairer society, a much greener economy, and political liberalism to unlock the forces of progressive politics, not just for tomorrow, but for the next century.
Thank you, Ed. Layla.
I completely agree that the place for our party is one that's distinctive, that can carve out a different space to the other parties against Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. We need to find that distinctiveness. That's how we're going to move off 6% in the polls, which is where we are now. And to do that actually means we have to do two things. One is understand ourselves, understand what does liberalism mean for modern Britain. And for me, fundamentally, it means freedom, freedom for the individual, but freedom to live a life that they choose. And to do that, we have to support their communities. We also recognize that in order to be free to have that choice in your own happiness, you also need to be free from poverty, ignorance, and conformity, all that brilliant stuff that's on our membership cards that still sends a shiver up my spine when I talk about it. And we start there. But that's not enough, because what's clear, and the reason we are where we are now, is because voters really haven't connected with that for a long time. And when you find that, the answer isn't they need to listen hard enough. The answer is actually you need to listen to them. We have to turn it on its head. And when we had those 2019, that result, I started door knocking. And I wanted to go and speak to voters. I went to Leeds, I went to Sheffield, I went to Kent and Devon and Cornwall and Pontypridd and Wales. I was about to go to Scotland and coronavirus sadly intervened. But what I was doing was asking voters what really matters to you, what would make you vote Lib Dem. And the three pillars that I've settled on in my campaign: education, emblematic of our investment in the next generation, emblematic of our investment in people. What better way to communicate liberalism? The environment, the biggest issue facing our planet, the reason why we have to work with everybody and anybody across the world. We are internationalists to our core, but let's use the environment to talk to that. And the economy, one that currently is so unequal, where people don't feel the benefit. And we need to turn that on its head too, to have a distinct approach to that that puts well-being at its heart. And the economic growth isn't the only measure by which we measure our own success. That is a radical agenda. And it was one that was informed by voters' opinions. We need to keep doing that, keep listening, and that's how we're going to rebuild.
Thank you, Layla. We're now moving on to a question that was asked by Venetia Kane, but several other people. And broadly speaking, the question is a simple one. What are the candidates' views on electoral pacts? And we'll start off with Layla.
So formal pacts from the centre, like Unite to Remain, in a way that frankly was demoralising for parties up and down the country. And I know that there are very many parties in Western counties that felt very much at the wrong end of that bargain. I don't agree with that. It didn't work, if nothing else. I mean, it's proven at the last election. Tactical voting, yes, but a top-down approach like that, no. However, where you've got places like in Oxford, West and Abingdon, and when we were looking after the referendum at the prospect of a 10,000 Tory majority, how are we going to overturn that in one go? We realised that if the Greens didn't stand down, if we couldn't get the Labour Party to send its fire elsewhere, in a sense, have a truce, and actually even better, come and campaign with us, we weren't going to overturn that majority all in one go. And that's what we set about doing. I had hustings with the Greens. I mean, these hustings, I have to tell you, are lovely compared to what they put me through. And at the end of it, I was convinced it wasn't going to work. But they voted unanimously to back me. And then they came and campaigned with me. And we took the fight to the Tories. We exposed what Theresa May wanted to do to this country. And that brought over those soft conservative voters that we needed. And we won by just 816 votes. I couldn't have done it any other way. And we repeated that at the next set of elections. We also repeated it at a local level, again, against the Tories, to take a council off them actually a bit unexpectedly to both sides, because this works, but it has to be bottom up. It has to be organically grown. And it's something that I think we should be looking at rolling out in those seats where we are second to the Tories to help defeat Boris Johnson and his government. That has to be what we're aiming for at the next election, but it's not going to work everywhere. And I don't want to be a leader for just one election. I don't want to be a leader for just a few years. I want to be leader for the next 10 years, 2 general elections. I've got one eye on the set of elections after that. And that's why that distinct liberal position, the one where we set out our clear ideas for what we want the country to be, where we can say that every Lib Dem MP that you elect is one more voice that we can add to that fight to change the country, because that's the right thing to do for everybody in this country. That's the offer that we need to make at the next election. And then that, in my view, is how we're going to yield success over the not just short term, but also the long term.
Thank you, Leila. Ed?
Well, thank you for the question, Melissa. At local level, when you're fighting a council seat or a whole council, I think the decision on this has to be taken at the local level. I don't think the national party, the leader, should come and tell you what to do. That's not very liberal. I think we should get best practice and understand what we've learned from other places. But the leader will be very much involved in thinking about how we rate other parties at the next general election. I'm very clear, there'll be no deal, pact, coalition, anything with the Conservatives. We're an anti-Conservative party. I'm an anti-Conservative politician. I want to kick them out. And that begs the question really about our relationship with the Labour Party. They're the huge big players. And there's 2 ways of doing it. One is to have a formal pact and a deal that's understood, that where people stand down and so on. And one is to have an understanding. I'm much more in favour of the latter, for the reason that the former don't really work. First of all, it assumes that all our votes go to the Labour Party. That's not true. If you've done a lot of canvassing, and I'm sure you have, I've been canvassing for 30 years, you find that a lot of our voters, their second preference is the Conservative Party. So there's 2 simplistic views about pacts and deals, I'm afraid. Moreover, making them happen can be very divisive, and you can let local parties down like we did with Unite to Remain and the Bristol West and the whole Bristol Party family. So I'm much more of the understanding approach, which is what Paddy did in the run-up to 97, and actually what worked in 2001 as well. And in 97 and 2001, we saw massive tactical voting. Lots of Liberal Democrats in seats where the Labour were the challengers, the Tories voted Labour and beat the Tory. And in many seats where Liberal Democrats were contesting the Tories, the opposite happened. I stand before you as a Liberal Democrat MP because in 1997, on the 1st of May, lots of Labour people in Kingston and Surbiton voted for me. And I wasn't even a target seat. I was number 106 on the target list, but tactical voting got me over the line. So I'm a huge believer in it, but the way you do it is critical. And I learned at the feet of the master, P. Ashdown, where there was a lot of choreography, of nuance, so people knew what was going on. And it was extraordinarily effective. And I think because Starmer isn't, this bogeyman like Corbyn was, putting off soft Tory voters, and because I think he's smart enough to know he needs Liberal Democrats to beat Conservatives, I think there's a real possibility there. We shouldn't run before we can walk. We should also be clear that where we're taking on Labour, we'll still take on Labour, or where they're main opposition. But we need to gradually do this. And I think it could be very exciting. And I'm certainly up for working out informal arrangements that worked so well in the past.
Can I thank both of the candidates? Can I remind both of you, though, we are trying to stick to 2-minute answers. And in that case, both of you were somewhat over. So if we could try and get the timing down, that would be phenomenally helpful. With the phone going in my background, showing that this is live, and showing also that people are joining in on the YouTube chat, we have a question come in from Globber on YouTube, and he asked this, or she, I don't know. In my constituency, which is similar to others in Western counties, many people vote Liberal Democrat during local elections, but Tory at the general election. How would you make sure these soft Tories vote for us in the general election? And Ed, if you'd like to go first.
Well, Glo, that's what used to happen in Kingston and Surbiton. We were doing really well at local level. We took control of the council in 1994, but we would try difficult converting those local votes. And what we did was, in our campaigning ahead of 97, we took local issues, but we linked them to national issues. And we made that link much clearer. And I go out campaigning on police, on the hospital, NHS, on schools. I take our national policy position and I link it locally. And it was far more effective. And I think that is a key to doing that. I think another way of getting that over is just by squeezing the third party. The more that we can show that we are credible, the credible alternatives, the more we can squeeze the third party. And finally, because Don's going to tell me to be quick, the reality is a lot of those soft Tories wanted to vote for us last time, but didn't because of Jeremy Corbyn. I think Starmer, because he's not going to scare the horses, I think he opens up the possibility those soft Tories will vote for us this time nationally. And that's exciting. And I think as long as we show that we're pro-business, pro-enterprise, that we believe in helping the self-employed and so on, and show that we're not some sort of dangerous left-wing party, then I think we can win those soft Tories. And I believe I'm the leadership candidate who can both squeeze the Labour Party and bring over, particularly with my economic policies, those soft Conservatives, so they do vote for us nationally.
Ed, thank you very much. Layla.
Thank you, Glo. So this is where we started in Oxford, West and Abingdon. And what we noticed was that people were happy to sort of give us their vote at that point, but because the majority was so huge, and also because of the national picture, they were asking, well, what is the point? What's the relevance of you? And to get them to vote at subsequent elections for the Liberal Democrats, I mean, it's great that they've started at local level, and I'm hopeful, I don't know which seat it is, but we have to build our council base. And if we don't have every single seat in that constituency, that's what we need to be aiming for. Of course, we'll probably never get there, but nevertheless, that's what we have to aim for. And the parliamentary candidates who are in that seat, who are having that one eye on Westminster, actually need to be working in total coordination with the local team, which in turn needs to be fully supported by HQ, so that there is a plan for everyone. So whether this is a seat that has a few councillors in it in some places, but we need more, and we maybe are having a two-election strategy, or is this one where we're on the cusp of taking the council and we've got a serious contender for next time? There needs to be bespoke plans in each of those seats that then dovetail in with the one that we will be running nationally. And it has to be done together. It's not the national ones imposed and you have to then take it. It has to be the other way around, very bottom up. But to the point about relevancy, actually, we need to show people that we are relevant as a party now, you know, not what we did in the past, not in some fictitious government in the future. What can we do for them and what can we do for people now? And that's why I believe cross-party working in Parliament is so important. At the beginning of coronavirus, I helped to deliver the coronavirus compensation scheme. This is the scheme whereby if a frontline worker in the NHS or social care dies, their family will get £60,000, which of course will never make up for that loss, but at least is some semblance of a financial cushion for a difficult time. But I did that by working with others in Parliament, including Conservatives, bringing them on board, working those networks. That is how we're going to get change done now. So that when people ask, well, what's the point of voting Lib Dem? And if you've got even one more Lib Dem across the country, what does that achieve? Well, what it achieves is real change for people now. And the two together, combined with a strong liberal message of distinctiveness, is, I think, the winning formula for our party.
Layla, thank you very much indeed. Now, Jeff Mills is one of very many local members who's asked a question about the EU. And basically his question is, do you think we should rejoin the EU? If so, when and how are we going to go about it? Layla, if you'd kick us off.
Well, first, to just say how gutted I am. I went to the European school in Brussels. My father moved there when I was 1. He then joined the Commission. My whole childhood was centered around it. The first flag I ever drew was an EU flag. And it's as much part of my identity as anything else. And I'm still mourning the fact that this country is leaving. We have a battle to fight first, which is that we have to absolutely avoid a no-deal Brexit. And that is a huge battle, and Boris Johnson doesn't look like he's listening. And that is going to put the very people that we care the most about, especially the most vulnerable, in a perilous state, and the farmers and the fishermen and everyone else who might have voted for Brexit, we have to remain on their side. We have to fight for them. And the reason why that's so important is that actually broadly what we need to do is to show people we are on their side, that we are going to fight their battles. And if we can do that, particularly on issues like animal welfare, particularly on issues like the environment, where we have high standards that we helped to develop when we were part of the European Union, and that the divergence in a cozying up to Trump is the wrong way to go, then we can start, not by saying I told you so, but start fighting their corner and then realizing that actually that was always the better option. So it's going to take time. I don't think that it's yet the right time to move the whole party to a rejoin position yet, but I sincerely hope that we'll get there within the next decade. And if not within the next decade, we should keep fighting for it. Internationalism is something that is in our veins as Liberal Democrats. We have to make the positive case for internationalism, generally working with others as a principle. And that is how we're going to move hearts and minds towards that rejoin position.
Thank you, Layla. Ed.
Jeff, I basically agree with Layla on this. I'm a passionate pro-European, and I want to lead a principled pro-European internationalist Liberal Democrats. And I'm sure your heart, like mine, hasn't left the EU, will never leave the EU. But what we've got to do is change public opinion. And that may happen quickly, and so we should leave the option open of when we decide to advocate rejoin. But we've got to make sure we are, in the meantime, making the case for cooperation with other countries on the economy and on trade. And with COVID, clearly it makes sense to do more cooperation, not to do less, as the Tories are proposing. We need to make the argument of cooperation for our farmers and for our rural communities who are going to be so badly hit by Brexit and are threatened with this awful trade deal the Tories are talking about with Donald Trump, with its implication for food safety, for animal welfare. And we need to make the case for cooperating with other countries, particularly our nearest neighbours, on things like climate change, on things like security. So let's make the case for cooperation and help shift public opinion. Now, if we can shift it quickly, who knows when we can start advocating it? But I don't think on this question, we should get ahead of public opinion, given what we've just been through. Let's face it, let's be frank with each other. The way we fought the Stop the Brexit campaign does damage in a lot of areas, including the west of England, the southwest. When we went to revoke, that turned a lot of people away from us, and we've got to rebuild that trust with them. And when I say the last leadership election was we need to reach out to Leave voters, we need to reach out to Leave communities, and we need to do that now to show them our social justice agenda tackling low wages, our green agenda with green jobs for the future, our caring agenda to look after the most vulnerable in society. That is relevant to their lives. So let's not obsess about Europe. If we do, we won't get a hearing for all our other Liberal Democrat policies. But let's stay true to our principles, and let's be part of a movement which shifts public opinion, so the day that we can join the EU comes ever closer.
Thank you, Ed. Now, you've both mentioned some of your successes in Parliament, but Nick Coates asked very specifically, while you have been an MP, what is your most significant achievement in the House of Commons and why? Ed?
Oh, you're asking me? Okay, fine. Well, Nick, thank you for the question. It has to be on climate change. Domestically, I led the push fighting the Tories who were trying to stop me for renewable energy. We became the world leader in offshore wind, massive amounts of solar, onshore and offshore wind. And I'm deeply proud of that, particularly as I see coal power stations now coming off the bars. We made a big achievement. But actually linked to that was my negotiations on climate change at the European Union, where I formed something called the Green Growth Group and got other countries to back our more ambitious climate change targets. And we managed to persuade those less green countries like Poland to go for a deal, which then pushed the Chinese and the Americans into a more positive position and ended up with the first ever climate change treaty in Paris. Now, of course, politics has gone a bit awry with Trump and Bolsonaro and so on since then. But if you want to know, Nick, my most positive thing I'm proudest of It's massive increase in renewables and helping to lead those climate change negotiations at the EU and at the UN.
Thank you, Ed. Layla.
Well, thanks for your question, Nick. When I won in 2017, which is 3 short years ago, I wanted to, first of all, really focus in on my constituency, but also to keep one eye on those big things. And the very first question that I asked in the House, which I like to think started a bigger conversation, was actually about Euratom. So Euratom is the treaty by which we have nuclear power. It's really important, particularly to fusion, particularly to research. It really affects my constituency. And I remember asking this question, the very first thing, even before my maiden speech, and people coming around and going, what is that? I don't understand what that is. And that then sparked a much bigger movement in Parliament to really take this seriously. And whilst we have not, sadly, stayed in Euratom, what we have done is made the government listen on that point. And as I've moved along, every time that there was a big issue in my constituency, I fought and fought and fought to change it. We've got a thing called the Oxford to Cambridge Expressway. This is a huge road between Oxford and Cambridge. An investment in road right now at a time of a climate emergency is just absolutely the wrong thing to be doing. I've been arguing that we should be electrifying the railway instead. And because of 3 years of campaigning on that, at the last election, the government announced a review, which we understand to essentially mean that at least the proportion that affects the constituency isn't going to happen. But more recently, since securing and changing my 816 marginal seat to now one where we're over 50% of the vote, the highest ever share of the vote for any candidate and any party in that seat, I've looked a bit more broadly. And I currently chair the inquiry, the rapid inquiry into coronavirus in Parliament. And while it's very important that there's a public inquiry at the end of it, and it's the right thing to do, I'm interested now in saving lives. I want to hold this government to account, but more important even than that, is to change the direction and nudge them into one that's actually going to put the focus on the people that this is going to affect, the bereaved families, those still suffering with coronavirus, and changing overall government strategy. You might have heard me last week talking about zero COVID, a move towards zero COVID. We started that conversation, and then it was picked up in all the newspapers today. We have to change the country for the sake of our residents, for the sake of the bigger purpose. And I'm really, really proud that through cross-party working, we've managed to pull this together in time, hopefully to make a real difference before a potential second wave.
Thank you, Layla. You've both already made reference to various green agenda issues, but Peter Saib asked the very basic question of the various environmental interventions that might be made under your leadership. What is your absolute top priority? Layla.
Thank you, Peter. So I'll start by simply setting out where we are now. Coronavirus, as awful as it is, and I just want to say, I so wish I was with you all. I so wish we were, somewhere beautiful and we'd maybe gone to a pub and had a pint of cider before and had that opportunity to see each other in 3D. But coronavirus means that we can't. And it provides, however, an opportunity as well as a horribleness, which is that people are seeing the underlying issues in our society. And this is a moment where it is absolutely right that the government invests in our economy. We are looking at a 1 in 300 year economic event, potentially Thatcher-style levels of unemployment. And that investment from government is right. When they've done studies showing what that investment should be used for, actually a green recovery is not just the right thing to do in terms of the environment, it's actually the smart thing to do in terms of the economy. And top of the list of interventions that they've looked at is insulating homes and planting trees. Now, the reason for those two, and there are more, research and innovation, there's investing in education, there's a number of them. But the reason why they are important is because actually very quickly, by making sure that there's investment to start up new companies, by making sure there's money in banks to be able to put into companies that want to do this, it's a very quick way of moving people from jobs that might be languishing right now, particularly I'm thinking of the leisure and tourism industry, and certainly that's an industry that affects many in Western counties, it certainly does in Oxford as well, into jobs that are going to help the environment. And you help those people by giving them employment, you're helping the environment, and thereby you're helping the economy. So there is a virtuous cycle that could be started now by investing in a green recovery. The government, sadly, don't seem to get it. But top of that, insulating homes. And by the way, that's also important because it helps the poorest. It helps to cut their energy bills. And those are the very people that we need to be thinking about the most at economic downturns, because they are the ones who are going to be disproportionately affected.
Thank you, Leila. Ed.
Well, I do think greening homes is the most important, because that's what the Climate Change Committee say. They say if we're going to get the easy fruit to try to make sure that we are moving towards net zero, actually it's the houses and our buildings we've got to do first. And it's actually not that expensive if we get it right. And it has the advantage of helping poverty and tackling fuel poverty. It also helps the economy, because you can get green jobs in every village, town, city across the country. So I want to put massive amounts of money into that. I'd want to change laws to actually require people to bring up their homes, if you're landlords, bring up your renters accommodation up. Leila also mentioned trees. I'm not going to mention trees. I'm going to mention something else, because it's actually very radical, although a bit more difficult to campaign on. I want to go to the City of London and pass new laws. I want to say to banks, stock exchanges, pension funds, insurance companies, the debt markets, if you're making investments, you have to, by law, take account of climate change risk. And if that happened, you would see huge amounts of money, trillions of amounts from the private investment moving from dirty technologies and dirty industries into clean technologies of the future. And that's something that government can do to make the private sector, not just in this country, but through our international capital markets around the world. And it would be a real boost to getting towards net zero carbon in this country and globally. So, think locally with your homes, I think globally with the finance.
Thank you, Ed. Now, a little later on, we're going to do a number of quick fire questions, but I thought we'd just have a quick practice, because one's just come in off YouTube, and this is from Sadie Trent, and raises a very important issue in Western Counties region, and it concerns scones or scones, depending on how you pronounce them. And her question is very simple. She wants to ask whether you have jam or cream first. Ed, very quickly.
Can I have butter and then some jam and then some cream? Was that just to a heart attack level?
You have whatever you like.
Thanks, Sadie.
I'm cream first, then jam.
Excellent. I don't know what you're going to do with that information, Sadie, but I know she's got another question.
Oh, Don, you're on mute.
Before we get to Sadie's other question in a minute or so, I just want to ask a couple of questions, given the urban-rural issues. It's very important in our region. Basically, the first question would be, how would you address the urban-rural divide when it comes to green policies such as public transport? Leila.
Well, this is an incredibly important issue. It's one I face in my own constituency, actually, because while people think Oxford, Western Abingdon, they think that's Oxford, actually, most of the constituency is not in the city. It's actually in surrounding towns and villages. And rural bus services are in an atrocious state. What we saw over the last few years, particularly with cuts to local government, and I just want to make a general point about our incredible local government teams, the ones who have been tirelessly helping people through coronavirus, but who have had to do so on greatly diminished budgets. Across the country, it's roughly halving of their budgets since 2010. And what that has meant is that rural bus services are very often the first to go, because they're the ones that are most heavily subsidized, and there just isn't the money. And bus companies are struggling to make ends meet, and local authorities, and sometimes it's the parishes that need to step in, or even volunteers running pick-me-up services. The reason why this is so important is to get people out of cars in the first place, yes, and driving down, no pun intended, the emissions from transport is the most important thing that we can do now. People have seen how this can be done through coronavirus. We need to be investing in electric vehicles. We need to be investing in rail. We need to electric buses, all of that. But also there's a social justice element to this, which is that by not having enough access to public transport in rural areas, it's disproportionately the young and the elderly and indeed the disabled who are the ones that get left behind. And for social justice reasons alone, that's why I've passionately campaigned for better bus services for my own villages, but why we need to do so across the country. It's the right thing to do if we're going to tackle those inherent inequalities and hopefully create a more equal society, not just north to south, but also urban to rural.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Well, the biggest influence on my thinking on this has been my wife, Emily, who stood for Parliament 3 times for us in North Dorset, which, as you all know, is very, very rural. And she thinks we need a lot more buses, but we need buses that are regulated. At the moment, the deregulation that the Tories put in place has actually undermined a lot of rural bus services. And if we re-regulate them, they can be better planned, and that we can actually probably get them in a more affordable way. It's very interesting in those areas of the country that have regulated buses, where the local authority or transport authority commissions them, bus ridership is going up, not down. So let's bring that new policy idea to rural areas. Let's make sure, by the way, the buses are fueled probably by hydrogen, as that's the greener type of buses you can possibly have. And let's look at community transport, for the elderly, for the disabled. The Tories have been attacking that as well. We really need to speak up, because I'm sure that they've got a hidden agenda of cutting some of these services. And I'd want to look at other areas that might work. So my mother-in-law, who lives in Shillingstone near Blandford, she's been very involved for a number of years on something called the Trailway, which is an old railway line, which she and others have campaigned to get properly turned over to people who are walking, on cycles, on horses and so on. And being able to use those old railway lines. It's taken a lot of managing with some of the aristocrats and the old feudal society in some rural areas where they own parts of the former railway track and won't allow people on. Let's try and stand up there. There are these ex-railway lines that are used. Let's do more of them. I think that would be good. Let's look at carpooling and car sharing. Let's be imaginative. We need to make sure people in rural areas are able to move around affordably and in a green way. So I think we should champion that.
Thank you very much indeed. We're now moving on to a question from Liz Webster. Liz is our Wiltshire and Swindon Police and Crime Commissioner candidate in the elections when eventually they happen. And she says this: Lib Dems are very London-centric. So she goes on to ask, what plans have you got to help agriculture and rural communities like Swindon? And Ed, if you'd like to go first.
Well, Liz, thanks for the question. And we've got to get away from any London-centric idea in the party. We've got to be a party for the whole country. And I think we've been less so, particularly at the way we prosecuted the Brexit campaign. And I think we're using Zoom and other technologies. We should bring the party together so everyone, wherever you are, is much more involved. And then issues like agriculture could be better debated and hopefully be stronger as part of our campaigning. And we've got an opportunity here, with Brexit being a real threat to many farmers' livelihoods, with a deal with Trump, a trade deal, threatening food safety standards, animal welfare, consumer standards. I think we can get both farmers and the public on our side. And the Save British Farming campaign, which I think, Liz, you've been a bit involved in, where it's talking about raising the issue of chlorinated chicken, raising the issue of hormone-filled beef. We've got stories there to get over to people in a real easy sort of consumer way why the Tories' approach on farming is so bad, why the Liberal Democrats are a much better option. And if we can combine that type of message on saving British farming, linking it with, say, food security. I think COVID showed us the need to make sure that we have secure lines of supply, whether it's on food or other things. So there's another argument we could put in there, and we can put in arguments about the climate and the green arguments as well. So let us be the champion of British farming and agriculture, and let's try and win over some of those former Tory voters who own and run those farms. I think they must be getting a bit dejected by how Boris Johnson and his ilk have forgot them and are betraying them.
Thank you, Ed. Leila.
Well, thank you, Liz. And yes, Brexit is going to really affect our farmers. And that is the biggest threat right now is Boris Johnson, the deal that he wants to do with Trump. I think the way that we approach this as Liberal Democrats, especially given that many of these rural communities, particularly the farmers, weren't inclined to vote for us at the last election. We have to find a way of winning back their trust. And I think the thing that we need to do is to work really closely with organizations like the National Farming Union, who have been making this positive case for why we shouldn't be going in with Trump and instead maintain, and the way they put it, and I think it's very cleverly done, the British EU standards, because that is where they're going to be selling most of their goods. And to be on their side, even if they didn't vote for us. The first year of my leadership, I want to be traveling the country, continuing this listening to voters that I've started, and I really hope I can, and I hope that coronavirus by that point would allow me to do it. And I want to spend time with farmers on farms, understanding what's going on with them, because so many of them are also price takers and not price makers. There's real issues with keeping them afloat, and they are the custodians of our land. If we are serious about tackling the nature emergency, not just the climate emergency, but the issue with biodiversity, we have to keep them afloat. We have to work with them on that. So that close partnership is really important. And just on the rural communities bit, I mean, I already spoke about buses, but I think it's really also important to talk about broadband, because whilst it's all great that we're doing this over Zoom and there's a big move towards flexible working, which I really support, it can help with work-life balance. And if it helps people get out of cars and that commute they don't have to do anymore, that is a preserve of those who are wealthy enough to have the broadband and the laptops, or who are lucky enough to live in rural communities that have a decent connection. And I think we now need to press the government on this. And I've been doing stories around this over the last few weeks, because it is about access to society, access to information. And as Liberals, we know that if you don't have access to information, you can't make positive choices about the life that you wish to choose. There's a Liberal reason why we care about this. And also, I think it'd be pretty popular in a lot of villages up and down the country.
Thank you very much, Leila. And that neatly leads us on to a question from Sadie Trent, who asks, how do you propose we can get new people involved in the party in particularly rural areas? Leila.
Well, thank you, Sadie, for your question. And getting new people involved, I think, is a really important part of what we now need to do. We've got 120,000 members, many of whom joined us after the referendum. So holding on to them, incredibly important. We need to inspire, we need to make them feel empowered. We also, however, need to be attracting new people. And actually, I think this is another opportunity that coronavirus has brought inadvertently, is the ability to campaign online, already notwithstanding the issues with broadband that I spoke to before. But what I've noticed is over the years, going to conference twice a year, it's expensive to go. It's something that if you've got time off, you can do. If you've got money, you can do, but otherwise you're frozen out of the party's processes. And that same applies to training, the bulk of which is delivered at conference. LDC do a brilliant job of getting into the regions, but actually the way we campaign, the way that we approach campaigning and interaction with our membership is not living our own values. We keep talking about bottom up, and yet so much of it's top down. I would love to see us live the values of devolution. Devolution of campaigning, devolution of member engagement, making sure that every single member in our party feels that they can be part of the process. And partly that's going to be answered by doing more stuff online, but also it's about fundamentally changing our approach to how we deliver training and how we deliver engagement across the party. And I think by doing that, that will then encourage people to get involved, increase our campaigning force, and will create a virtuous cycle on the ground where people feel valued, people feel like they're being invested in. And if you invest in your people, that's how you achieve great results. So that's one of the priorities that I would bring as leader.
Thank you, Leila. Ed?
My experience of trying to recruit members and keep them and reach out to different communities. I know I'm not in a rural area. I only have 5 farms in my constituency. It's about making it fun. And I think that applies wherever you are. And in rural areas, maybe there's not quite so much to do. Maybe, being part of a social group where you end up having a drink in the pub afterwards or going to the cafe for a cup of coffee, that could be somewhere where people feel they're part of the community, and making us relevant to community and the place to go if you want to do something for a community, I think is really important to both hold on to those wonderful new members we've got and also recruit more. And also ensure that we're not just having loads of members who aren't necessarily doing stuff, but members who are helping in the campaigns because they want to change their community for the better. When COVID started, I was looking at, as acting leader, the problems of people campaigning, given the health problems and safeguarding issues. And so I worked with local government, the Liberal Democrat local government family in the voluntary sector. We put together something called the Coronavirus Community Task Force. You might have seen it. We put lots of guidelines and ideas online. We shared best practice, and lots of Liberal Democrats at local level got involved in helping their community during the lockdown, helping the more vulnerable, the elderly, the disabled. And I thought that was community politics in action, the best of Liberal Democrat campaigning, living our values, living our ideas. And do you know what? If we want to get more members, Sadie, I think that's the sort of thing where we're the ones who are seen doing things, who are having fun. We're the ones to be with. I was almost going to say we're the cool guys, but maybe that's, for me, I shouldn't say that.
Thank you, Ed. Now, here's a question from Mary Page. Mary, you should know, is the Bristol mayoral candidate in 2021. And Mary asked this: air pollution has been a major issue, contributing to around 300 deaths per year in Bristol, and it's equally posing challenges in Bath. Lockdown has made it drop. What can you offer to keep it down? And Ed, if you'd like to kick off.
Well, first of all, Mary, thanks for the question. And you're right that air pollution should be very high on our campaign list. The health damage it does to young people, to children, to people who are more elderly, respiratory problems, cardiac problems, even links to dementia. Air pollution is something that we should be linking with health, where people really take notice and being the leaders on. And there are going to be different solutions in different places, Mary, as you'll know. In Bristol, I know you're doing an awful lot on public transport, and walking and cycling. There's a big push for electric vehicles. All these things can help. And I hope that in your campaign, I know you want to get rid of the Bristol mayoralty, but you'll work with Stephen Williams, who is now our candidate for the West of England mayoralty. And I think we can really win with Stephen. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Electing Stephen to be the mayor of the West of England next May. Wow. And if he could have the powers and we could get more powers for him, then he could really do something on air pollution. So, in your different villages, towns, cities, there are things you can do, and there's lots of Liberal Democrat policy on it, but we need to be in power to do that. We need to win, as you've been doing actually across the Western counties in local government. Next May, big elections, the counties in Somerset, Gloucestershire and Wiltshire, a number of other areas, but of course the mayoralty for the West of England, which we can win. So I guess my answer to you, Mary, is with you and Stephen in those mayoral candidates, can we start winning, and then we can put into power good Liberal Democrat policies which cut air pollution and help people's health.
Thank you, Ed. Leila.
Well, this is a huge issue that has started to rear its head, and partly because the UK government was taken to court over this because of its inability to tackle air pollution in so many of our cities. We have the issue in Oxford where we're pushing zero emission zones. We're trying to get rid of cars right in the centre of the city. We need to invest in cycling. We need to invest in buses. We need to invest in trains. And coronavirus, I think, has again shown us what city centres could be like if we take cars out of them. We have to change laws so that we've got more of a European style use of the road and use of the sidewalks, to be able to spread out and have that cafe culture that is so effective, and make sure that we don't end up in a situation where, you know, places in Bath, I know if you live near one of the congested roads, is the equivalent of smoking 20 cigarettes a day. This is awful for people's health, but it's not just about the cities. It's worth noting that in some of the most recent measures of air pollution, there's a tiny Dorset village, in fact, that has the A35 running through it, that has the worst NO2 emissions in the UK. So it's not just about investment in our cities. We also need investment for our rural communities. And the best vehicle to get this to people is through local government. They are absolutely brilliant at doing this. It needs central government to give them the money, but they need to be the ones to deliver those local schemes that are going to make all the difference, that are going to invest in our infrastructure so that we can take people out of cars and into more green ways of traveling for good. I'm a huge fan of cycling. I'm very much a fair weather cyclist, and have been part of the all-party group on cycling for a very long time. And the lack of investment in cycling in particular is something I feel really passionately about, because that should be something that is so much easier for people to do. I'm glad Boris Johnson seems to be putting, again, small amounts of money into it, but we could have a cycling revolution in this country. And that's one of very many schemes that I hope central government will continue to support local government to deliver for people on the ground.
Thank you, Leila. Now, several local members have asked a broad question about the coalition. And so the question is, would our next leader benefit from or be hindered by being a member of the coalition government? Leila.
Well, I'll take this as a view, because actually it's not ever going to be any one thing. But this is my view on coalition itself. It happened. It's in the past. And what I want to do for the party is for us to move forward from it. Now, that does not mean forgetting it happened, because we can't. The history is there. And it's the equivalent of saying, do you regret what happened in your childhood? You know, it's something that's there. But you can understand what went right and wrong. You can show that you've learned from it. And there are things in it that I'm incredibly proud of. And Ed will talk about the green agenda, and I completely agree. The other is, of course, the pupil premium. And as a teacher, I proudly stood there on the stage at conference talking about how incredible that was. But to not show that we've learned from the things that we're less proud of, I think is a big mistake. The bedroom tax was a huge mistake. The number of people that were affected by that, people in my own constituency, I remember as a candidate being there with people who were affected by a woman in a wheelchair who'd been told she had to move. She had a spare bedroom, a box room that her son used to come to help care for her. And she was in tears. And I sat with her for 3 hours as she looked over this letter, wondering what to do. And we helped her and tried our best, and she had to end up moving. There are people who were left destitute because of decisions taken in that time. And we have to show that we have moved on and understood, and tell people that we will never again return to austerity. We will not balance the books off the backs of the poor. There were mistakes that were made. We accept that there are people badly affected by them, and then we draw the line. And so voting for me in this leadership election is a signal to voters, and indeed activists from other parties who quite happily wield pitchforks saying we're all just yellow Tories because of that time, that we are moving on. And that's my approach to coalition.
Thank you very much, Leila. And Ed.
Well, there's some evidence for people to look at about this question. The evidence is when we had a leader with Tim Farron, who voted against a lot of the coalition measures. Tim voted, it wasn't a minister, and voted against most of the controversial measures. That didn't help us when he was leader. Under Vince Cable, who was a cabinet minister throughout the coalition, in May 2019, we got our best local election results ever, our best European results ever. So there's some evidence that it doesn't really have any impact. I don't think you can take a pick and mix approach to the coalition. Clearly there were difficult issues, of course there were, with the Tories. But we achieved so much. And I would say, if I was asked a question by one of the, the key interviewers in the run-up to the election, I talk about what I achieved. That would be a reasonable thing to do. I talk about nearly quadrupling Britain's renewable power, making us a world leader in offshore wind. And then I pivot away, because that's what you do in interviews. You then take it to what you want to talk about. And I'd use that credibility I'd got, that experience I'd got in developing renewable power, in creating green jobs all around our country. I then say, and that's what we'll do if you elect Liberal Democrats. We've got a record. We've got the best record on climate change. You can go and read the facts. And if you elect Liberal Democrats, with me leading the party, we are credible on the green agenda. And that's why we can deliver, because we did it before. So I think that's the way to deal with it. I really don't think the evidence suggests it's as big a problem as some people have tried to make out. And the question is, how can you utilize it for the future elections, be they local or be they national? And I think I've got the ability to work with people to make sure we can get the best out of it.
Thank you, Ed. Leila talked about learning from past mistakes, and Rich Wiltshire asked the question, what would you have done differently to Joe in the last general election? Ed. Well,
I will answer this straight, but I want to caveat with just one or two remarks, if I may. I fought a leadership election with Joe. We were very cordial. And when I lost, I just was extremely loyal to her in public and in private. And I think we owe her a debt. And yes, it was tough. She was only a leader for 4 months. Really difficult for her, very difficult times. And the general election review does have criticisms of Joe, and I'm going to come to them. But it also has criticisms of other things going back quite some time about why we didn't do so well. So I'm going to answer the question, Rick, about Joe, but I want you to see it in that context. And I don't want people to blame Joe for lots of stuff, because I think she did an amazing job in a short period of time. But I've done two things differently. First of all, I wouldn't have said, vote for me to be Prime Minister. You can say that internally to the party. And I think that's, you've got to motivate people, inspire people. And, I think that's right, because we need to be ambitious. But if you say that to the media and to the country, it's a bit like when David Steele says, go back to your constituencies and prepare for government. It becomes something they use against us. It's a hostage to fortune. So I wouldn't have done that in the general election campaign. And the revoke policy, I was always very skeptical of. I was told by Joe and her team that it would be a back pocket issue. Would we still focus on the second referendum, which would enable us to reach out to Leave voters? And I was quite surprised when it became not a back pocket issue, but a front issue. And I think it was the linkage with Joe saying she wanted to be Prime Minister, because if you want to be Prime Minister, then you're going to be able to revoke, aren't you? And I think the combination of that was toxic. And I tried my best to get them to change it, because it was clearly a disaster in the campaign. And I regret to say that they didn't. So that would be the difference. But please do not go down the rabbit hole of blaming Joe for everything. There were many other reasons why we didn't do as well the last election. And that's why the general election review is so important.
Ed, thank you very much. Leila.
I'll keep it short and echo some of those remarks. And when there are criticisms of Joe that either of us make, it's not on a personal level. It is about, what happened at the time, at a time when actually not all of the office was even hired. However, I agree with saying that you're going to be Prime Minister from the position that we were in, and albeit by that point it was 20 MPs, is incredible, as in not credible. And when you lose credibility in the midst of a general election, when people vote in general elections, we see this all the time, they vote with their hearts very often, more often now than I would say ever before, not with their heads. And what that said to people was that, my God, the Lib Dems are just full of themselves. They think that under first past the post, where they're coming from third place, that they're going to leapfrog other parties and take seats that they've never had before. And actually, the biggest mistake that we made was forgetting, in my view, that the first past the post system gives out no freebies. That's why we want to change it, because what it doesn't do is allow people to elect to have the government that they actually voted for. And had we, just mapped those election results from the Europeans onto the map, or even the revoke petition, where you saw those seas of yellow, I could see where that was coming from, but we forgot about the very system that we don't like and we want to take down. And so we have to learn the most fundamental lesson, which is that if we're going to win, when opportunities come, and we don't know what's going to come. Think back 3 years, we just had the referendum. We, at that point, just started talking about having the final say, and people thought we had 3 heads. And then we had that general election where it was we'd absolutely changed the narrative on it. Forward 3 years' time, we don't know what that big issue is going to be, what that big opportunity is going to be. But we do need to build our teams on the ground and to try and win vast numbers of seats without investing in that local infrastructure first, having those plans in place, empowering those activists, making sure that that training is there. I think that was the bigger mistake. And that wasn't just Joe's mistake. That was a mistake that the party's made for the last few years. That's what I would want to focus on first.
Leila, thank you very much. Now, I did warn both candidates in advance that we would move to a time when answers had to be very much briefer, practicing for doing the sound bites for TV. And we're going to begin that maximum 1 minute, please. And we're going to pick up on something that Leila, you touched on, a question from Sarah Hearn. And she asked, if we ever get another chance at holding a referendum to get PR, what would you do differently to ensure a better result? And what will you do to push for that referendum? Leila.
Well, Sarah, I would actually want to learn the lessons from the last coalition. If we were in a position where this was on the table at subsequent coalition negotiations, actually, I think it's something that we need to be delivering potentially without a referendum. That change to the voting system is so critically important, so important for us as a party to deliver, that would be one of the things that I would seek to negotiate with if we end up in a position, and it might not be actually at the next election, it may well be the one after that, who knows. But what would we have done differently in the Yes to AV campaign? Actually, the big problem with that, and there was a huge number of different issues with that particular campaign, but the biggest one that I saw, and I was prominently campaigning in it, was that it was, first of all, a bit of a shambles who was actually running it, but second of all, that teams did not feel empowered from the ground up. A referendum is a moment where every single person across the country has a vote, and we didn't in that referendum at all empower local teams, local groups to run the big campaigns in every part of the United Kingdom that was necessary. So making sure that we learn the lessons from where we've had referenda that went wrong. I don't think it was necessarily even the message that was the problem. It was about the way that we were campaigning. And second of all, let's make sure that if we're going to settle on a form of proportional representation, if we get to that point, that we know which one it is that we want. Because the other thing that I remember from that particular campaign is that we ended up squabbling between us about which was the best version of PR, and people campaigning against an alternative vote because it wasn't enough. And we have to make the case within our own movement for whichever form it is that if we were at that point campaigning on a referendum that we wanted to support.
Ed?
Thank you, Sarah. First point, let's try and get PR without a referendum. That means persuading Labour of the case during this Parliament and getting them to put in their manifesto commitment to legislate for PR without a referendum in the first Queen's speech. I'm not saying that to be easy, but that should be our first objective. If we can't get it without a referendum, first of all, we need it to be a referendum on PR, not AV. Secondly, we need to make sure that our coalition partners, if it was a coalition with the Labour Party, bring it in. Don't want to prejudge that, but if it was with the Labour Party, bring it in, that they were going to campaign for it and not against it. And final thing, if we could bring in England PR ahead of Westminster, if we can get the timing, if that's the way the timing goes, then if people can get used to voting with a single transferable vote, as they are in Scotland, that would make it a lot easier to win a referendum. So I've got lots of ideas, Sarah, about how we do this, because it is so important. We've got to get it.
Thank you, Ed. Can I remind both candidates, we're trying to keep the answers nice and brief, and we've got one from Claire Cape. She says, as the party of internationalists, how would both our great candidates ensure that our country shows some real backbone when it comes to international human rights transgressions? Ed.
Well, we need to pick a number of issues. Alistair Carmichael's been brilliant on the Uyghurs and on Hong Kong citizens, and I think we've led on the campaign for human rights against China. I'd like us to do something on international rights for the LGBT community across the world, because they're so discriminated against. In some cases, they face the death penalty. So I'd like to pick a few examples so we can campaign on and get traction and show to the electorate that we are committed internationalists and committed to international human rights.
Thank you. Layla.
Thank you, Claire. Internationalism is in our DNA as a party. And interestingly, when we look at the past, where did we make major breakthroughs? Whether it was Paddy with Hong Kong, was it Charles Kennedy with Iraq? That was the very first march I ever went on when I was younger. And I was so inspired by what he was saying that I then finally, really took a good look at the Liberal Democrats and saw a party that spoke to my values. And at the heart of those values were human rights, and of course, social justice. And so where we don't know what the next big flare up may be, we have to be the party that is right there at the front of these. We mentioned the Uyghurs, we've also had in the past the Rohingyas, and actually I think we could have perhaps have done more for them. And where there are injustices anywhere in the world, people will see that the Liberal Democrats are right there at the forefront, making the case for our internationalist values of social justice and human rights. And that will get them to understand where our liberalism comes from.
Thank you. Ed?
I'd already answered it.
Right, I'm going mad here. Don't worry about it. It's getting very confusing. There's questions coming in absolutely thick and fast. The next one, again, short answers, please. And Layla to start. This is a question from Simon Oliver, who basically asks, are you in favor of universal basic income as a way forward?
I am, Simon. Predicated on what we're seeing with coronavirus, universal credit is not working. Far too many people are slipping through the cracks. We have to find a way to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so for me, a universal basic income, especially now, in a time of huge turmoil for the country, is the right thing to do, the specifics of which does need to be debated by the party. And that's really important. It's the party that makes the policies. I'm glad that there is a chance at the next conference to start to have this conversation. I'd like to see us have a well-developed, fully costed policy by the end of next year.
Ed?
I worked on the policy when we last had it, when it was called Citizens' Income under Paddy, and I costed it. So I remain very committed to it. And one of the reasons is it helps unpaid carers. If we're going to be the champion of carers, we've got to offer something to the unpaid carers. Millions of them. Many of them are most of the women and people from Black and ethnic minority communities. It would be a real egalitarian policy. So I'm really keen on it. But you do have to answer the question, how are you going to pay for it? So I put forward the idea that all these COVID loans that we've given to hundreds of thousands of businesses, many of them, the business won't be able to repay. And they won't be able to repay them, or they'll struggle to repay and won't be able to grow. We could offer to the businesses, it'd be their choice, to convert the debt into equity. So we as the public would have shares in their businesses. We put that in a sovereign wealth fund, and the dividends from that fund over time would enable us to afford a universal basic income. So use COVID-19 economics to create a more equal society. That makes sense to me.
Thank you very much indeed. And we move on to, again, from YouTube, Bruce Hunt asks, how do you balance the need for mass house building alongside those who object to large-scale development in rural areas?
Well, first of all, you've got to do all the brownfield sites. You've got to make sure that you're looking at sites in your town centres and city centres. And let's face it, a lot of officers that used to be needed with home working, there may be a less need for them. So we need to really look at that again. We can't go down the planning route that Genric, the Minister for Local Government outlined today, where completely denuding the planning system of any controls, that would be a bad idea. But we need to try to make sure that local communities and local councillors and Liberal Democrat councillors have the tools and support for them to be able to get that balance right. And I think if we look at the planning system again, not like Generic, as I said, but in the Liberal Democrat way, where a lot of emphasis is put on that local plan, and that local plan where people really come in and work out where the houses are best built, I think that's the way to get around NIMBYism, and so that local people are choosing where those houses for the young people in their village and towns can go.
Leila?
This is a massive issue in Oxford. We have a green belt. And what I've said in Oxford is that we need to do this with the community, not to the community. I'm really proud that the Vale of Whitehall actually has one of the highest house building rates in the whole country. But the Tories have been insisting on not protecting the green belt, not building on brownfield sites. I was arguing for more housing to be built in the centre of Oxford, instead of using that for business premises that in fact should be perhaps elsewhere. And if you have communities in mind, rather than just developers' interests in mind first, that's a great place to start. It has to be done absolutely at the local level. It's local government that should have more power and more say over this. And I'm a great fan, incidentally, of the neighbourhood plan. Not even at that macro level, but villages and towns themselves coming up with a plan where they identify the best places to put the houses, but not just the housing, also the infrastructure. We need to stop seeing them actually as houses. We need to start seeing them as homes. And if you start seeing them as homes, you start seeing them as communities. You then build in the cycle lanes from the beginning, not as an afterthought. The total change of approach, the Liberal Democrat approach, is how you can do this and also keep those people who may object to it on side.
Leila, thank you very much. I'm delighted you like neighbourhood plans. It was one of the successes of the coalition government when I introduced them as a minister. But moving on to doing deals, we've touched on this already, but there's a very specific question from Sue Craig, and she wants to ask, do we need to work with Labour to form a progressive alliance? If not, why not? If so, how?
Is that to me first?
Leila, yes, please.
Thanks, Don. Thank you, Sue. So, to the specific point about a sort of top-down progressive alliance where, let's say, for sake of argument, Unite to Remain, well, it just didn't work. This was the problem. And we've kind of tried something like this. We could argue for a longer run up and do something that sort of is a stitch up between the parties at the top, but that I don't think is the way to do it. And the other reason why I think it won't work is because if you look in seats, particularly that are marginal between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, a really good example actually being Canterbury, where the Lib Dems stand, we are more likely to take votes off the Tories than we are to take votes off the Labour Party. And that's really counterintuitive, I get that. But in conversation with other Labour MPs who are standing against the Tories, their preference was always that actually we stand a candidate, but this is the critical bit, that we don't campaign against each other, that we encourage tactical voting, and probably not the parties themselves. Actually, we encourage the third party sites and do that from far out so that they don't have conflicting information, which was another bit of the problem. But that on the ground, if we can engineer a situation where in those Tory seats, where we are the clear second place, that the Labour Party recognises it's in its own interest to not campaign against us and ideally go campaign elsewhere, or even better, as some of my Labour activists and members did in Oxford, West and Abingdon, often in the dead of night with hoods on, delivering my leaflets, and they were doing it as part of a third party group of progressive alliance voters and activists who came in to help. And that's how we achieved the huge swings that we have done in Oxford, West and Abingdon. So it's a much more bottom-up approach. It's not something that is masterminded and engineered right from from Westminster, it's engineered actually on the ground, and it's much more organic. And what you do then is you infuse people, you increase your campaigning forces. It becomes really fun because you get this huge influx of people that you didn't know coming to help. It's an incredible feeling when you show up and you thought 10 people were going to be there and it's 50. What we can do at the top, though, is that myself and Keir Starmer, as leaders of the respective parties, make a decision to say on the question time that we might have during that election, to not take pops at each other and to recognise that the common aim is to deprive Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party from a government. And you can signal that truce and then let the magic happen on the ground.
Thank you, Leila. Ed?
Sue, just as why I will never do a deal with the Tories, I'm very open to the idea with Labour. But let's work out how we bring this about. The first thing we need to do is rebuild our party. At the moment, no one's going to be interested in us because we're not winning. And so making sure our liberal values, our liberal priorities are coming through, that we're winning in local elections across the country. That's why May 2021 is so important. Let's build us up so people start looking at us again and going, well, let me help. We need to take account of those guys. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, while I think Keir Starmer's made a great start, I think the jury is still out. Clearly, he's more progressive and he's more amenable to us than his Corbyn. So that's great. But is he really in charge of the Labour Party? Has momentum gone away? Are they going to change their attitude to us? Are they going to embrace electoral reform? We don't know the answer to these questions yet. I hope they're answered in a way which would enable working together. So if we're stronger, and they turn out to be a partner that we can do some sort of arrangement with. As I said before, the arrangement is, do you make it formal or informal? And I think my experience, over 30 years in the party, particularly seeing the way that Paddy Ashdown did it before 1997 and Charles did it before 2001, it needs to be much more local based. It needs to be nods and winks, and it can be very powerful if you do that. Tactical voting in 97 and 2001 was off the scale. It really worked. And we need to work to get that back again.
Thank you, Ed. We're coming to the end. We're going to have one final question, and then both candidates will have 2 minutes to make some closing remarks. And to get that in time, it does mean short answers to this question, for a rather general question from Francis Haywood. And it is, what is your recipe for re-energizing local parties? Ed first.
I want to make sure that they realise that we in HQ and in Westminster think that's the building block. And I want to help local parties to, in their campaigns, make sure the regions and the counties have the resources, the organisers, so they can organise those campaigns. I want to send out the message that it's going to be fun. And I want us to feel that we're the sort of anti-establishment party. We're the insurgents. We're going to take on them. And just in the way that leaders have in the past, the way that Liberal Democrats have grown up, we're going to stand up to the big parties and big business and big unions and so on, and really get that motivation going again across the whole party.
Thank you, Ed. Leila.
We have to live our values. We talk about decentralization, we talk about devolution, but then we don't apply it to our own party. And actually, if you look at how much training is actually available to our membership, it's very little compared to how it used to be. That ecosystem of organizers that we used to have 10 years ago has diminished. We have to make sure that local parties are empowered and trained up and given all the support that they need in order to help drive this mass engagement. And a lot of members tell me that they don't even know which local party they belong to. We have to make sure that every single person who is on an exec position doing a really important, slogging their guts out for the party without any remuneration, because they, for the love of the party, are given the support that they need to then maximize those people to come and campaign with us. And then the second part to it, the recipe really has to be energizing by having a big common purpose. And for me, that is reviving liberalism, having that bold, progressive message that we can get people excited about in this country again. That has to be where we start. Common purpose and lots and lots and lots of support on the ground.
Leila, thank you very much. We now move to an opportunity for both of our candidates to make some closing remarks, a maximum of 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask Ed to go first. Ed.
Thank you for all your questions, and thanks, Don, for sharing. I hope I've shown you that I have the vision, experience, and judgment to lead our party. Together, we must tackle the huge challenges we face in our country and inside our party. I want to work with you to build an economy where we invest in green jobs, build a fairer society by investing in education, and giving carers a much better deal. The Thornhill review of the general election shows us there's no quick fix to our party's challenges. But I know that by building firm foundations, we can shape a message and build a party machine that can speak to every region and community across England again. I've been touched by how many great campaigners across Western counties are supporting me. Stephen Williams, the former MP for Bristol West and the future Mayor of the West of England. Councillor Vicky Slade, the amazing leader of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council. Max Wilkinson, who fought such a great fight as our general election candidate in Cheltenham. Councillor Dina Romero, our brilliant leader of Bath and North East Somerset Council. Helen Belcher, our fabulous PPC in Chippenham. Gideon Amos, another great PPC, this time from Taunton Dean. Val Keach, our winning leader on South Somerset. Mick Clark, our excellent candidate in Yeovil. And Jane Ashdown. I'm grateful to all of them for their support and the support of many others. Together, let's campaign our socks off. As leader, I will build the Liberal Democrats back into a strong independent party. Yes, I want to defeat this awful Tory government. And yes, I'd consider informal understandings with Labour to do that. But let's keep the Labour Party at arm's length. No pacts, no joint campaigning forces. So please, join the likes of Shirley Williams and Daisy Cooper and back me as leader to lead winning campaigns for a greener economy, a fairer society, and a more caring country. Thank you.
Ed, thank you very much. And Leila.
Well, thank you, Don, for chairing. Thank you, everyone, for your really interesting questions. And I'm sad that this is over because it sounded like there was a lot more discussion to be had about scones. Now, more than ever, however, we do need a strong liberal vision to challenge the Conservatives and move our country forward. Tackling inequality through investment in early years and a universal basic income. Championing a fair economic recovery that supports small businesses, protects our environment, and stamps out racial discrimination in our society. And of course, bringing decision-making, living our values closer to people by radically decentralizing power from Westminster. But in order to get any of this done, we first have to build our strength as a party and push forwards from the mistakes of the past. Steady as she goes simply can't cut it anymore. We cannot risk dropping any lower than 6% in the polls. But I know that we can seize this moment. With the right strategy, message and leader, I know we can do better. And I know that we can rebuild our council base and become a stronger political force. My campaigning vision of education, the environment, and the economy will get our voices heard. But we need to do this together. We start by rebuilding trust again, winning across the country from the grassroots, winning mayoral elections, winning council seat after council seat, like we did in Bournemouth and Christchurch and Poole, winning whole councils like we did in Bath and North East Somerset, so that we can show people like Jacob Rees-Mogg that Lib Dems, when you elect them, really get stuff done. Electing me as our leader sends a clear signal to voters that we've learned from our mistakes from the last decade and that we're a party moving forward. Now is the time to reinvigorate our party, to hold the government to account, and we need a leader that voters can believe in. I am that leader. So please vote for me and let's move forward together.
Leila, thank you very much. And can I, on behalf of everyone in Western Counties, say a huge thank you to both of you for being with us tonight and for taking our questions. And as you rightly point out, many others that we've sadly not had time to get to. You've got another 15 hustings to go, and I'm sure we wish you both very best wishes as you do that. And some of us instead might be taking a short break. But good luck to both of you. And can I thank everybody who's been with us tonight and those who will watch subsequently, the very best wishes. And just remember, I don't know what it means, but stay alert. Good night, and thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks.